have Twitch chat open. I feel like it might be a little bit distracting for
Okay,
me.
cool. So we are Fantasy Talk. We're back for episode 4 this time. And today we're going to be talking about matchups going into week 2, what that means for the season going forwards. First, I guess I'll introduce each of our 3 panelists today. First, we have Anthony Lynx Leung. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hey, how's it going?
And then we have Lin G. Did I say that right?
Yeah, you got that right. And hey, everyone.
And I am Gustav. Today, again, we're talking about going into week 2, what your fantasy should mean. Because basically, week 2 is kind of a scary week because everything that happens in week 1 is not really indicative of the rest of the season. Just because there are so many different variables going into things. So what we're going to do for now is just go over each of the teams and talk about how they looked individually. And let's go ahead and start with Europe. How about?
Yeah, sounds good. So I think one of the teams that really did not show up at all was Meet Your Makers. Meet Your Makers just simply did not look good. They had to play with a sub. Corey's out, and it doesn't look like he's going to come back. These were flat out terrible. And from week 1, it almost seems like all of them are not only benchable, but droppable. I've seen Mimer on a few waiver wires already. They just cannot find kills, averaging 7 kills a game, which is terrible. Almost lowest among the entire LCS strategically. They are just lost, and it's a good thing that they're facing H2K in Copenhagen Wolves this week, which is a lot better because they both tend to give up a lot of kills, 15.5 and 19.5 kills a game respectively. So the wins will come down to how the team fights turn out. I definitely would keep Mimer and Rallis on hold because there's a potential to get points there, but they're definitely hard to trust.
Yeah, I think moving past Meet Your Makers, it's really hard because Selfie was really the heart of that team. He was a solid mid that came in and gave them a lot of pressure, and without him, it seems like they've fallen apart.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
week 1. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so week 1 was actually especially tough because I noticed actually in the first game for Mimer, he actually ended up scoring negative 0.47 points. So that's definitely a red flag. Hopefully that doesn't happen again come week 2.
Yeah.
Another team in EU is H2K, which Meet Your Makers is against this week. H2K looks equally bad. Bad on both ends, actually. They, same as Meet Your Makers, cannot find kills in either of their games, averaging only 9 kills a game so far. But here's a stat that stuck out to me. They're tied for dying the most in the entire LCS so far. 19.5 deaths a game, tied with C9, actually. Their top laner this seems to be the only potential carry on that team. Giants have given up at least the least amount of kills, so it's going to be really a slim pickings for them in their game 2. If they're going to score any points, it's going to come from game 1 against Meet Your Makers. But even then, despite Meet Your Makers' struggle, they've only given up 12 kills a game, so that's still above average. I would just straight up bench, if not drop H2K, unless you're really, really desperate.
Yeah, and looking at that matchup, it really is do or die for both of those teams because they've shown that most of the other teams on the lower end can take them out. So whichever team can win this matchup is probably the one that's not up for automatic relegation at the end of the season. Moving just a little bit higher in Europe, Gambit was another team that was really hyped coming into this season. They had that victory at IEM Cologne. They looked like they were maybe a team to shake things up in Europe. Their first 2 games were really disappointing. They didn't seem to have that same Gambit cohesion of going and finding team fights, and you could tell because they really, really struggled when it came to just putting down any sort of fantasy points. Most of their players weren't in the very bottom of fantasy, but they were still pretty low. Darien, for example, was about 30th from the bottom. Cabo Shard. He actually played a lot like Darien. He just died way too much, but he is not Darien. And overall, it seemed like their really aggressive style didn't play well against the European teams that were just able to take advantage of it and seem to be playing smarter this season. It seems like Gambit's style has always been rampant aggression, and as teams get smarter and smarter, that's harder and harder for it to pay off. And another team that went to them with IEM Cologne, Roccat, had pretty similar struggles. They did manage to pick up one more victory than Gambit, going 1-1, but it didn't really foster any sort of fantasy scoring whatsoever. Roccat is a team that likes to play the objective game, that likes to grind things out, and that style of play meant that they just didn't get any kills. Against SK Gaming, they got wiped out, and then when it moved on to their game against Gambit Gaming, they won against a relatively weak team, but they still didn't manage to put up any major fantasy points.
So go ahead and moving on to Elements. They came out 1-1, which compared to some of the other teams isn't bad. However, given that they are Elements, formerly known as Alliance, they were expected to come out 2-0, but then Fnatic managed to pull off an upset, and Elements really didn't score many points that game. Their carry scored around 10, and that's pretty bad, especially if you were expecting them to carry you through your fantasy league. This week, they should be facing against Roccat and Copenhagen Wolves, which are slightly easier teams, so they should have better luck against them. And I would definitely keep Elements on your bench, if not on your starting roster, because I'm sure they'll definitely pick up their slack, and Reckless and Froggen will be able to rack up some points come this week.
Yeah, as someone who actually first round drafted Nif and picked up Wicked pretty early on, I was quite disappointed in how Elements played. Coming up a little higher in fantasy, and this is going to be a strange pick for a lot of people, but Copenhagen Wolves put up pretty good points for being one of the lower level teams in Europe. They took down one of their opponents, I think it was it H2K? They took down H2K in their first game, and then when they later faced off against a higher caliber team, the Giants Gaming, they didn't do very well. But they did a good job of dragging the game out to the late game against H2K, which gave them more points than you would expect from such a weak showing. So I think their players, maybe you should consider dropping, but pick them up again when they have a good matchup like H2K or like Gambit.
So looking at Giants, they came out 2-0, which is quite a surprise, especially since they just came out of the expansion tournament. This week they'll be facing H2K and Unicorns of Love, both teams of which they should be able to beat. However, something we have to keep in mind is that their opposition let Warlid get Jax for both of the games that Giants played week 1, and I wouldn't expect Unicorns of Love or H2K to let Warlib stay on his comfort champion. We might have to see if his champion pool gets any larger and if he can still carry with other champions. If Jax gets banned, I still see Giants winning simply based off of the mechanical skill of their carries, but I wouldn't expect Warlib to rack up as many points as he had week 1.
Still, I feel like anyone who did pick up Giants players has to be feeling like it's a bit... I mean, did anyone here draft Giants players?
I picked up Pepperino.
Yeah, which makes them... I mean, Pepinero was like pretty much the only one worth drafting, and so people who had them on their team got a lot of value for them since they picked them up, that
I think
late.
come week 2, though, Giants is going to be matched up against Unicorns of Love, so we'll have to see which mid laner comes out on top, because I feel like basically the team that has a stronger mid laner when it comes to this matchup will probably end up taking the game.
Definitely.
Now moving on to SK Gaming, I think they're a very solid pick because they're very good at getting objectives, and then either getting kills before or after objectives. They're, especially for their jungle and their bot lane, they racked up quite a few fantasy points, and they came out with very few kills. Something that you will not see SK Gaming do is make any desperation plays or plays where it feels like that they're really reaching for kills. Often if they get behind in early game, they'll probably just sit back, wait a bit, farm up, and then fight when they're ready. This week they'll be facing up against Unicorns of Love and Gambit Gaming. Against Unicorns of Love, they should be able to pull off a win, simply because Unicorns of Love tends to play very aggressively. And SK Gaming is the type of team that enjoys sitting back and waiting for the other team to make mistakes. Um, Unicorns of Love might be playing right into the hands of SK Gaming, and against Gambit, they're simply the stronger team. Another team that did really well this week is Fnatic. Fnatic actually came out with 2 wins despite having a completely new roster with the exception of Yellowstar. However, he was able to lead his team to 2 wins, and with Fnatic going up against Gambit and Roccat, it shouldn't be difficult for them to go 4-0 after week 2.
So looking at those top 3 teams, Fnatic, Giants, and SK Gaming that we just talked about, well, I know Shox said on air that on the Primetime League that she rates them Fnatic, SK Gaming, Giants. Obviously, from a skill perspective, that seems like a pretty good rating. We haven't seen Giants be tested, and while SK Gaming is good, they didn't have the same level of dominance that Fnatic did, where, I mean, you know, Fnatic looked kind of like they were styling on Elements, who were supposed to be the top team. But from a fantasy perspective, how do we feel those teams deserve to be rated against one another? Anthony?
Well, I definitely see that Fnatic has the most kill potential, and in fantasy, that's pretty much all we care about. I mean, yeah, you don't want them to die. They negative half a point, and you can't get kills if you're dead. But really, kills is what drives everything. It drives the amount of assists that your team has. And you look at Fnatic, it's not only just kills, but they're really high in assists as well. It means that they're team fighting well together. And then you look at SK. SK has decent amount of kill average themselves, but they're not a high-power offensive team either. You look at last split, they really weren't a high-octane offense either. Like Lynn said, they're very opportunistic, which is good, but I definitely would say Fnatic is up there. And Giants, on the same note, they are untested at this point, beating up on 2 what it seems to be bottom of the barrel teams. You like to see that in fantasy, but you're not always going to get 2+ matchups.
No, I do definitely agree that Fnatic is probably the front-runner choice, but one thing to consider is that Fnatic seems to have retained, despite the fact that Xpeke and Soaz are gone, the same sort of like highly aggressive pick-focused style that they've done in the past. And as we've seen with old Fnatic, sometimes what that can mean is that 1 or 2 players on Fnatic are getting all the points as they catch someone and burst them out of position. And so I feel like there is some room for 1 or 2 players on Fnatic to do poorly in a given game, and Fnatic still steamroll a game. Whereas SK Gaming, on the other hand, has a very team-oriented style. You noticed in their second game, they relied a lot on that pick potential, but it was more of a team-oriented style of play. Like, they were all there, they were all making the play, they would pick someone off and then dragon. So even though they score fewer kills than Fnatic does, it seems like they always do it as a team, and I think just occasionally that gives them the edge in fantasy.
Also, in Fantasy LCS, there is a slot for the team, and because of SK's objective control, they might actually be a better pick than Fnatic for the team slot. So that's worth considering, despite the fact that Fnatic definitely they definitely beat SK in fantasy points for week 1. At least their players did.
Interestingly enough, the Giants Giants Gaming seem to have a similar style. If you look at team points, they scored the most team points per game at 19.5, just half a point ahead of SK, and a point and a half ahead of Fnatic, but that's still, pretty strong signs of life from a team that fought its way through the expansion tournament. Again, we will have to see how that plays out when they face better teams. That really only leaves us with one European team, and I think we saved this for last for the obvious reason. It's hard to know where they're going to go, and that's the Unicorns of Love. They are not 2-0, unlike the other 3 teams we rated at the top, but one of their losses was to Elements, which again is a team that everyone expects to jump back into the top 3 pretty quickly. This seems to me to make it a pretty do-or-die week for them, where they face off against the Giants, currently 2-0, and I believe SK Gaming, who are also 2-0. How do we feel about those 2 matchups this week?
Well, I'll start off. Unicorns of Love versus Giants Gaming is really interesting to me because on paper, Giants is a really good team. They have decent kill potential, and they've only given up a total of 10 deaths in the entire LCS so far. Best record so far. I never thought Giants would look like a great defensive team. Maybe it was just because they were against Copenhagen Wolves and what remains of Meteor Makers. But definitely, it's an interesting matchup. I think they would it would be pretty even if as long as Unicorns of Love doesn't overextend. I feel like Giants is also a very good team that capitalizes on mistakes, and I think when you're against a team like SK, I think Lin can speak to this. That you got to play safer because they will punish your mistakes harder than other teams will.
Personally, I'm also not really willing to buy into the hype of Unicorns of Love just because the only team we have seen them beat outside of their victory over TSM at IEM San Jose was Gambit Gaming, who again has looked very unspectacular. They do, I think, stand a decent chance in their matchup versus SK Gaming, precisely on the strength of Power of Evil. We actually saw Power of Evil face off against Wata Fox, the mid laner for SK Gaming, in the Challenger Series all through last year, and he was consistently destroying him. He just is a monster in lane. And mid has kind of historically been, at least over the last two splits, SK's weak spot with Jess's previously, and so if Power of Evil is again able to exploit that and then push that mid game, that mid lane strength into the other lanes, a lot of the strength of SK's measured but aggressive style doesn't seem like it will help them very much if they are losing that key lane.
Well, SK Gaming actually does have a very good jungler, and they did end up switching up their mid laner. So it's definitely possible for SK Fox, their mid laner, to hold his own against the Power of Evil, especially with the help of Svenskeren, their jungler. We've yet to see if Unicorns of Love can actually win against SK, but SK definitely have a history of a mid laner with a good amount of fantasy points, who's also able to produce solo kills when needed, as he did against Meteor Maker's sub. I think it was Blizer 300.
Okay, so looking at all of those teams in Europe, what is one matchup to look out for? I'll start with Anthony.
Well, definitely the matchup that I'm most interested in Europe was the aforementioned Unicorns and Lovers Giants Gaming. I think that there's just a huge potential for points for both teams, and we really want to see how Europe kind of figures itself out. We started before in the preseason saying that Europe's just a complete mess, and it's so hard to determine if a team's actually good or not. A lot of them looks like they have huge potential, and a lot of them looks like they're just bottom fodder teams. It looks like Giants has risen in the very beginning, but I want to see Giants continue that, making solid fantasy choices. If that's the case, then there'll be a lot more options out there for fantasy owners. Unicorns of Love, I'm really going to look at Kikis. He tied junglers 5th in assist. The team really runs through him, so I'll really keep a lookout for him in that match as well.
Okay, and Lynn, matchup of the week for Europe.
For me, it's SK versus Unicorns of Love, simply because SK has a very strong bot lane, and their jungler is also very good. Unicorns of Love, on the other hand, also have a good jungler, but their mid laner is probably slightly stronger. Power of Evil is definitely better in terms of KDA, but that might not necessarily translate into being more mechanically talented. So we'll have to see what impact the junglers have on the mid lane and who comes out on top. Unicorns of Love like to play aggressively, which means that they might play right into hands of SK Gaming, or they might get the better of them. On the other hand, SK plays very systematically. They capitalize on mistakes, and one thing they really have going for them is that while their ADC and mid are good at staying in the backline and not dying, they're also good at doing steady damage output. So they'll never just be sitting in the back getting completely zoned off. Either way, I think SK and Unicorns of Love are definitely both good picks for your starting roster.
So it sounds like one of our questions is really, again, to ask that question that was asked on Primetime League: is Unicorns of Love, are they a contender or are they pretender? What do the two of you think?
I'll go first. I think sorry, I think Unicorns of Love. I think they're good, but I don't think they'll end up top three or maybe even top five. So I think they're a pretender, but I guess we'll have to see as the weeks go on.
And Anthony?
I see them as a team that needs to figure things out early on, kind of how Curse was last split, kind of flounder around towards the mid-bottom half of the EU LCS, but later on pick it up towards the end. So it'll be interesting to see how Unicorns of Love develop through the split.
All right. I think I would probably also agree that they have a lot of work to do. To me, I see them, again, needing that time in at least the first half of this split, maybe the second half of the split, and we'll see them step up as it goes on. But this is their first split in the LCS. It's a different stage. There are different demands that they need to meet, and so I think it will take them some time to really be a top contender in Europe. They've given a strong showing so far, but as far as fantasy goes, I think because of their very chaotic playstyle, they're a fantasy pick that could be either really risky or really weak, because we don't know what style of play they're going to come out and play every given day. Like we saw at IEM San Jose, they came out with Twisted Fate Jungle, which I think nobody would have predicted. Nobody knows how many fantasy points to expect from a Twisted Fate Jungle. And then on the other hand, they're also a team that has a lot of questions as to their skill, and so it seems like any given day they could come in and have a great explosive fantasy day, or they could be your dud for the week. For me, that's a little bit too much of a gamble to take, but there are certainly worse teams to draft from. Let's go ahead and jump across the pond into North America and just work our way up from the bottom. Anthony, do you want to go ahead and hop at Cloud9 since they had a great week one?
Yes, Cloud9, number one NA team, last split, is now 2-0, and it's looking very, very likely that they'll lose 3 in a row against Team Liquid. They got COG after that as well. Cloud9 has never lost 3 games in a row, and I don't think they'll lose 4, but 3 is looking very likely right now. They're giving up 19.5 kills a game to enemy teams, but only securing 8.5 kills a game, which means C9 is third worst in terms of kills and in the entire LCS, and last in terms of deaths. Terrible, terrible on paper, on screen. You take a look at Team Liquid, which is the complete opposite. They have basically met or exceeded expectations. They're above average in kills. C9 will most likely have to outmaneuver them to have a chance at winning the game, meaning there's probably not going to be a lot of kill potential. If anything is going to come, if there's any fantasy points to be had, it's going to be coming in this game versus COG. COG has been giving up 18.5 kills a game, slightly better than C9, but still both teams have been doing really poorly on defense. Potential bloodbath here. They were 2-2 last split, so they should be matching up pretty evenly. I would start Sneaky, and that's about it from C9's side.
Yeah, it's definitely worth noting that Sneaky, despite being on a team that went 0-2, did not really have a bad fantasy week at all.
No, he didn't.
Which is surprising, because normally when a team loses, the AD carry suffers the most. The team can't protect him, he dies again and again, he doesn't get any kills. But actually, I think Sneaky came in, it was 8th place out of all AD carries, and for it, again, being on a team that went 0-2, he's definitely worth keeping. Next from there, let's go ahead and we've got a massive 1-1 tie. Every team in North America that isn't Team Liquid or Cloud9 is 1-1, so I'm just going to kind of assign them out at random, and we'll go from there. Lynn, do you want to go ahead and talk about Winter Fox?
Yeah, Winter Fox, actually, they also had quite a few roster changes. And for the first week, they were playing with 3 subs, which is actually extremely impressive that they were able to go 1-1. And part of the reason they were able to win their first game is because they would just four-man gank mid, and mid was brutal. Pobelter was able to snowball, and then eventually he ended up carrying the game along with help of their AD carry Altec. Um, I guess going into week 2, we'll have to see how Helios, Avalon, and Imagine step into the shoes of their subs because Shorty, Ace, and Glebe, as well as players, pulled off some great performances. Definitely not anything you would expect from subs. This week they'll be going up against TSM and Dignitas. Against TSM, I don't expect them to win, but I do expect it to be a very competitive game, simply because both teams both have very good mid laners, and basically whichever mid laner gets started gets going faster, or whichever jungler pulls off the first successful gank on mid lane will probably end up snowballing that lane into eventually what should win the game. Against Dignitas, they should be able to win just because their laners and their carries are stronger. Dignitas also came out 1-1, but Winter Fox last week wasn't playing even close to their full potential, considering they were just playing with subs they just got a few days ago. So we'll definitely, these are both definitely interesting matchups to look out for on week 2.
So what's most interesting to me about Winter Fox actually is we saw that they were putting all this pressure on ganking mid again and again and again, getting Pobelter rolling. When you look at the fantasy points, however, Altec was a much better fantasy pick than Pobelter was. Pobelter was actually like 15th or something for mids, coming in at 15.74 points per game. On the other hand, Altec was the third highest scoring AD carry in the entire LCS. Again, being on a one-on-one team where all the pressure was going mid, I just have to feel that he is like one of the most powerful picks right now, because to go 1-1 and to score as many points as Fnatic's Steelback did, basically. He was only, 16 points behind him, and he was 5 points ahead of Doublelift. The only two people that challenged Altec as the best fantasy AD carry were, again, Steelback and Keith McBrief, who had absolutely beastly weeks. So for me, the story of the game is what happens when Winter Fox is a full team and focuses a lot of their attention on getting Altec snowballing as well. That just seems like a terrifying prospect for other teams, and I think anyone who has, is looking at a choice between, say, Altec and Pobelter, that should weigh in heavily. Pobelter got camped, was mediocre. Altec was all alone by himself and was a complete badass.
Well, you can kind of see it from last split as well. Even when the entire team were to just flat out be terrible, Altec was the only one that gets points. Pobelter would be the number 2 option, but you would always see Altec put up a performance regardless on how his team does. That's just kind of how the team is built around.
So Winter Fox will be taking on Dignitas this week. How do we feel about them, Anthony?
Oh, Dig.
That's a good enough answer.
Split, we should just end it there. That's we want to talk about it. You take a look at last split, and you take a look at the new roster, and you say, anything got better or worse? It's just kind of status quo. It's pretty much the same story. They always been a really strong defensive team. They don't give up a lot of kills. Right now, they're only giving up about 9 kills a game, good for 4th in the entire LCS. But on the other hand, they're terrible at finding kills. Crumbs is all about vision, not about ganking for kills. They have 6.5 kills a game, which is good for worst in the entire LCS. And they're against 2 teams that have strong performances in week 1, or at least in one of those games, in Gravity and Winter Fox. Gravity looks like a middle-of-the-road team that can definitely catch fire at any time. We'll be looking at how they do, especially when they come off a strong win from C9. And then they're also against Winter Fox. Winter Fox, you talked about it just now, and they do seem to have like a little Jekyll and Hyde factor to them. Maybe it was due to subs, maybe not, but their best game was with the subs anyway. So it's really hard to tell how they're going to be. But either way, Winter Fox has been giving up decent amount of kills. If Dig is going to get any points is probably going to come off Winter Fox. Regardless, I would still straight up bench all Dig, if not drop them by now.
I would have to say that benching Dig, if there is one decision you make, looking at anything, benching Dig should be the decision you make, because we're looking at a league where there are 4 teams currently that went 0-2. Gambit Gaming, H2K, Meet Your Makers, and Cloud9. Dignitas, despite going 1-1, was in the bottom 3 of fantasy points for every position except for mid. So, like, some of the 0-2 teams scored better fantasy than Dignitas did. And the reason for that is simple. Dignitas really started off the week 0-2. The only reason they won their game is because Coast, like, decided to take Baron while the other team took their Nexus.
They capitalized on a strategic mistake. It felt like they didn't really earn it in a way. I mean, it's good on them to capitalize, but at the same time, it wasn't very well deserved either, I feel like.
And our team's really going to, make another giant mistake like that again? It's hard for me to see that happening. So the fact that they were down so early against 2, it just doesn't feel like a good precedent going forwards. I think having them on your fantasy team at this point, no matter how long you've been a Dig fan, feels like a little bit of a mistake to me, just because they were so... They weren't even lackluster. They were kind of, from a fantasy perspective, a little bit offensive. On the other hand, I don't know. Who knows? It's Dignitas.
I think something to keep in mind in NA is that the standings after week 1 have proved that just about any team can beat any other team. Like, Gravity beat C9. So Dignitas might be able to pull out an impressive week against Winter Fox and Gravity if something were to go wrong. However, it seems unlikely that they'll be scoring a lot of fantasy points. But if you're a firm Dignitas fan, then they might be worth sticking with for another week or 2.
So another team that was kind of confusing to watch, really, for me had to be Team Impulse, because Xiao, we have to keep in mind, was the MVP last year. He was extremely dominant. It seemed like nobody could lane against him in mid, right? Like, we had spent a whole split being like, oh my god, Bjergsen is like the second coming of Big Fat LP. He's just gonna... Sorry, that's a season... I'm old. He's I don't know, some other mid laner that you might recognize. he's the best mid laner. Bjergsen can't be stopped. And then Xiao just sort of comes in and is like, no, actually, I'm the best laner in this league. Everyone's gonna follow behind me. He put up huge fantasy points last season, and even on a team that's essentially 4 randos, you would expect something out of Xiao. But that team really looked like they didn't have a handle on what to do at all. And part of it seemed communication. Rush was way too aggressive in the enemy jungle. That cost them a lot. But on top of that, Xiao was not winning lane in the same way that we're used to seeing him dominate lane. He was really almost not a factor. He ended up putting in the 4th fewest fantasy points of any mid laner. Again, despite that 1-1. The only 3 teams below him are 3 0-2 teams. And that's not the sort of performance we expect out of Xiao. You have to kind of question, is that the new Xiao, or are we going to see him bounce back? It's hard for me to imagine someone dominates all of the mid laners for a whole split and then just falls off. So I feel like dropping him right now would be a mistake, even despite his really poor performance. The rest of the team, I don't know if I can say the same for. None of them really has the pedigree that he does. I think the main test for them coming in this week is how they acclimate to the addition of, obviously, world champion Impact joining the team. So I think maybe if you're holding on to your Impulse players, wait a week, see how the team looks with Impact. If there's some signs of improvement, then it might be worth holding on to them, starting them in future weeks. But right now, it feels very unsafe to start Team Impulse players.
Actually, I have a comment on Xiao. You could say that his supporting cast isn't as good anymore, or not proven, or not even together yet. But he made a lot of mechanical mistakes that he usually does not make. You look at just how he played LeBlanc. It was not a good game for him, regardless of his teammates. It's really concerning because you would think he would be the only bright spot in that
Right.
team. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
So Team Impulse fought their way, of course, as LMQ through the Challenger scene. The only other team to make it into North American LCS in recent memory through the Challenger scene was Team 8, who took down Complexity quite convincingly, and their week 1, for me, was pretty damn good for a Challenger team. I mean, they weren't Giants Gaming with their 2-0, but they also faced off against a different level of competition. They lost to CLG in kind of a weird game that made me question their ability going forwards, and then they took off a commanding lead versus TSM. Slushy, while he did, die early to Bjergsen, he came back with a vengeance in team fights, landing basically perfect Orianna ults with a lot of tricks that we don't normally see out of mid laners. One particularly cool one, he hid the ball over the wall so he could just, tap it over an inch and ult, and that fight turned the game around. He ended up being a huge scorer. Cali Trolls was in the same vein of Wicked or Werlib. He was one of those top laners that really demanded attention again and again, and the rest of the team was able to ride that wave in. I'm not sure I'm really convinced by them as top fantasy picks, but they put up a surprising showing, and they're probably sitting on the waiver wire in a lot of leagues. I think that makes them worth going out and picking up just because they have pretty good sleeper potential if they have good matchups. Of course, they did, however, lose to CLG. I'm not willing to talk about CLG's potential, but if someone else wants to take that.
I'm down. CLG, if you're a CLG fan, you kind of been through this roller coaster ride already. CLG, a strong start in the first game and then kind of tapered off again in the second game. We're looking at Team Impulse and Cloud9 for the matchup this week. I think they'll go 1-1, particularly against Team Impulse. COG should win handily due to the lack of cohesion we've seen in Team Impulse from week 1. In addition to TIP is world champion Impact, and that is a big unknown, but I don't think that should really affect the outcome of the game so much. They're only middle of the pack in terms of deaths given up to enemy teams, so even though they looked pretty bad in terms of just functioning as a team, they've been all right on paper in terms of defense. Cloud9, I think we touched on this a little bit earlier when we were talking about Cloud9's matchups. They went 2-2 with Cloud9 last split. They're a pretty evenly matched team. But right now, due to how Cloud9 is just completely reeling from 2 losses, they may be able to push their luck and hand C9 their potential 4th loss of the split. Really high kill potential here, but we don't know what to really expect out of COG. You would expect the game to be high kills, and they'll go ahead and focus on objectives. We also don't know what Zion Spartan brings. We've seen him last split, very, very uninspiring fantasy choice, but maybe a better play in real life than fantasy. I would say it's still 2+ matchups for COG. Start all your COG with relative confidence, save Zion Spartan.
I'm gonna go against the grain here, actually, and say 0-2 for CLG.
Oh.
But I'm then going to say that they're still good fantasy picks, at least some of them. Link actually put up, this is a strange stat that you might not believe when I say it. Link has been this, depressing mid laner that no one wants to talk about, right? He goes to CLG, he doesn't really do anything for a split. He goes to Cloud9 for the All-Star break, he comes back and everyone's like, oh man, he's been playing on Cloud9, he's gonna be this god now, and he was just kind of mediocre. Link was the 3rd highest scoring fantasy mid laner last, just going 1-1 too. That's really impressive. It wasn't like CLG was dominant. CLG took 2 random victories. He's not like Pepinero, or Xpepi, where you just have, a team plays well, and so the mid laner gets good points. If you look at Xpepi, he's actually, I think 9th, if I remember correctly, in fantasy points for mids. So Link to me seems a strong fantasy pick, but I'm really worried about this top lane, because when you think Zion Spartan, what's the first champion you think?
I think
Jax.
Jax.
Yeah.
Everyone thinks Jax. Zion Spartan, Jax. Now, I'm sure Zion Spartan's been playing Jax for a long time, but if you look at Season 3 Worlds, where Jax was pretty much the dominant top laner because no one could go top and face him, you had a lot of these teams leaving Jax open thinking, I'll just pick Renekton, and then all these good Jax players outplaying those Renekton players. You can't look at that and not think of the most dominant team, the best, arguably the best top laner in that tournament, Impact. And so for me, it's a little weird to say, well, you've got Zion, he's going to do all this shifty stuff, when Impact is sort of just a better him in that sense. And I feel like that will make a pretty big difference because CLG's weakness has historically been how do you fix that top lane problem. So for me, again, that's really going to all come down to the Impact matchup, and I think that will snowball down through the other lanes and get the win for Team Impulse. And I think Cloud9 will probably lose to Team Liquid, as much as it hurts my heart to say that. And having never lost 3 in a row, they are going to be hungry for a victory against CLG. So I feel like it's going to be a rough week for CLG, but they'll probably still put up good fantasy points.
I think for CLG to actually beat C9, Link would have to outperform High in lane with or without the jungler's help.
That's not
and then
that hard.
Doublelift would have to, and then Doublelift would definitely have to go even, if not be the sneaky elimination bottom lane. But Doublelift and Aphromoo have always been, they've been dubbed Rush Hour, and I wouldn't be surprised if they were to win bot lane. So as long as Link was able to pull out some kills against High, and then Link comes out strong in the team fights as he did in week 1, they could be able to pull off a win against Cloud9.
So, okay, looking at all of those teams, that's kind of the less interesting fantasy picks, but we do have really a top 4 picks to watch, in my opinion, and I think in all of our opinions. And that's Coast, Gravity, Team Liquid, and TSM. Now, TSM, Gravity, and Coast all had one really strong victory and one kind of painful loss, right? Gravity took down Cloud9, Coast lost to Dignitas embarrassingly, and TSM lost to Team 8. And then finally you had Team Liquid, who, while they came out 2-0, Dominate even tweeted to his fans, hey guys, don't get too hyped. Like, we beat 2 mid-level teams. So, you don't want to get on the bandwagon before we've even managed to prove anything. Looking at those 4 teams, which ones are you willing to believe the hype about, and which ones do you think are really just, 1-1 because they will be middle of the pack?
Well, I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to say I believe in the hype for Coast, actually. I see them doing well, at least for week 2, simply because they're going up against Team 8 and Gravity. They've already proved that with their jungler and with their mid laner imported from Europe, that they're able to win, and they're able to pull out decent fantasy points. So I hope to see them continue doing well, and then I guess we'll have to see how they do against Team 8 and then Gravity.
Looking at those 3 teams, I actually definitely have to say, between Coast, Gravity, and TSM at least, Coast feels like one of the strong contenders, fantasy-wise for me. Impaler was a fantasy beast last season on Super Hot Crew, and so he's obviously continued this style. Coast really was a top fantasy scoring team last week as well, so they seem like a solid investment, whereas Gravity lost their first game and then took out a Cloud9 that, as we've all seen, has really been struggling and playing not very smart. So for me, that feels like a good start for them, but not something to write home about. Whereas Coast seemed to put up a strong performance, except for their derp at Baron. But looking at Team Liquid, how do we feel about them with their 2-0 being, again, against basically middle-of-the-pack teams?
I know that Dominate said they were pretty much against mid-level teams, but I don't think that really matters. I think the way that they won, how dominant their wins were, really showed what kind of team they want to be. Even with that world champion Piglet, you sub in Keith McBreed. Of course, he held his own. He's very good, but it's hard to make that team any better. And then week 2, you put Piglet in, and you just got to think they are the team to beat no matter who they faced week 1. I mean, 24 kills a game, 11 and a half deaths a game, 62 um, assists. It's just amazing. Team Liquid definitely very solid. It almost does not matter who. It'll be interesting to see which team can take them down first in the NALCS.
I think the big point for me is, like you said, that substitution, because you're looking at the top fantasy scorer, Keith McBrief, and you swap him out for Piglet. Like, how does that not make the team just insane? Because Piglet's, we saw Keith McBrief actually do that thing where he flashed after LeBlanc and queued into the Fog of War to kill her. That's Piglet's move, is just flashing over bushes and killing people. So, like, if Keith McBrief, who, again, is this challenger tier player that we know is kind of good, is able to put up that sort of performance, yeah, they're going to face tougher opponents next week, but those tougher opponents are going to face Piglet. I hesitate to say that Team Liquid members are sitting on the waiver wire in anyone's league, but if they are, you should pick all of them up.
I mean, I feel like if any team can actually beat Team Liquid, it would be either Cloud9 or TSM, which are the front runners coming in before week 1. After Cloud9 went 0-2, they're looking a little bit shaky, but they can definitely regain the objective control they had in Season 4 and in Season 3, and if they were able to pick that up again and then just to play mechanically solid, they might actually have a chance at beating Team Liquid. Furthermore, Gustav did touch on the fact that we're going from Keith McBrief, the highest fantasy point scorer, and then we're going to Piglet. However, there's something we have to keep in mind is that Keith McBrief is an NA solo queue player. He speaks English. Him and Xpecial don't have any problem coordinating, despite the fact that they only had 2 or 3 days to practice. I've been hearing that Phoenix actually has pretty good English and that he can translate for Piglet. However, the fact is that there will be a bit of a language barrier, and we'll have to see if that has any effects on the games coming up this week.
So, for me, that Team Liquid versus Cloud9 match, again, this is me speaking as a Cloud9 fan who really wants them to win. For me, Curse hits at all of Cloud9's weaknesses, because A, they showed that they were a rotationally brilliant team at the end of last split. Yes, Cop is gone, Piglet is in. Yes, Voyboy is out, and Voyboy was a large part of their success due to his unorthodox playstyle. But, Curse was so good at First Bloods in the end of that. Dominate had like 7 out of 8 of the last games. He ended up getting First Blood. And if there's one thing Cloud9 is terrible at, it's having an early game go wrong and they just, they stay in it for a long time. But they have never been known for their laning phase or for their early game. And having such a dominant jungle, like I Will Dominate, just seems like Cloud9's Achilles heel, especially with how poorly they're playing right now. Looking at the games in North America, what are your matchups to watch? Like, fantasy-wise, what are the picks that just you don't really know, that you feel like they will determine the rest of the season?
I can start. So, the match definitely this week for me is COG versus C9. I almost think that C9 is definitely going to lose against Team Liquid. And if C9 falls to 0-4, that's it's almost unimaginable before the season started. But if they fall to 0-4, you can pretty much drop all C9 players, and no one can blame you, no matter what happens for the rest of the split. Remember that there's just not enough weeks in Fantasy LCS, especially in this split, to warrant carrying them for so long on your roster, and hopefully you're not starting them. I mean, make some trades, scour the waiver wire. You got to do something else. If C9 comes back and wins at least one game this week, yeah, it's a good sign, but I'm still not trusting them.
Just for the record,
definitely COG at C9 is the match to look at. Go ahead.
I ended up dropping C9 players for Team 8 players, so we'll have to see how that works out. And if Cloud9 does end up losing the first 4 games of the season, I'll be feeling pretty good about my Team 8 pickup. So
Yeah, I think
we'll have
I
to see
was
about
matched up
that.
against you in week 1, and you were like all
Yeah.
C9, and I remember looking at it after the match to be like, man,
Oh.
I won that matchup, right? And it was like all Team 8, and I was like, what? What is happening? And that's probably an upgrade. See,
We'll
I'm
have to see.
hoping actually for the O2 by Cloud9 because it's getting a little bit crowded in here. As a C9 fan, there's like so many people. I'm like, no, guys, get out. Let me love my losing team. I'll have to get used to being the losing team, but at least there won't be quite so many of me. Um,
Uh,
what about
the
you?
matchup
Matchup score?
I'm looking at for this week two is TSM versus Winter Fox. I feel like they, as I mentioned previously, that they both are strong mid laners and their junglers look to be questionable. Santorin's showing at IM was definitely poor. In week one, he did better with his ganks for Bjergsen. However, it seems like he invests a lot into Bjergsen, and if Bjerg can carry, same as he did last split, then TSM should be able to come out on top. But um, if Kilios is able to get off a successful gank first on Bjergsen and he dies to that, it shouldn't allow Pobelter to snowball. Something we've also touched on is that Altec is actually very mechanically skilled. Like he's a very stable player to choose, and the fact is that Altec should be able to pull off a good number of points whether or not the team decides to invest a lot of resources in him. Um, with this said, it'll be likely dependent on the mid lane. However, with bot lane likely swaying in Winter Fox's favor, um, I think there's a possibility that Winter Fox will actually end up taking this game. But we'll have to wait and see.
For me, the game to watch actually has to be. And I never thought going into week 1 that this would be my matchup to watch for week 2, but Team Coast versus Team Gravity. This this feels like a bad dream, but they both really put up surprisingly strong performances and also really good fantasy performances. And I don't know whether it's they were just playing against teams who are having a bad day, or North America is now the new Europe where any team can win on every given day, or one of those teams is really starting to be a top contender. Personally, I'm hoping for Coast because I have like half of their team on my fantasy team. But I think it'll be an interesting match just because you do have this sort of there's a lot of old pros on both of that team. You've got Saint Vicious and Cop on Gravity, but backed up by this young player Keen, and by again this sort of small time veteran Chris. I don't know if you remember Chris. He played for Team Velocity back in the day, and I actually made fun of him in our week 1 show. I said, if you remember this Chris, it's the Chris from Velocity, so don't pick him up. Um, so, oops. Sorry, guys. But then on the other hand, you have Team Coast, which no, I mean yeah, he's on Team Coast. Um, on the other hand, you have the new roster of Team Coast, which is like all of these European players who have also done well. So there's a lot of returners that are showing more value than we expected them to, and when you talk about potential, I feel like that's exactly what that is. That's players who are now in a much different environment and their talents are starting to shine. So for me, the team that wins between Team Coast and Team Gravity are kind of like the fantasy picks to watch for a while. Just because everyone knows Winter Fox is good. Everyone knows Team Liquid is good. No one really knows what to do with Team Coast or Gravity right now. Um, it just seems hard to say. And in that matchup, I think the key players to look at are definitely the jungler and the top lane matchup, because we saw Chris be an absolute god, Impaler was fantastic, and Saint Vicious and Hanser don't have the same sort of pedigree as those two players. Moving on from the matchups, what do you think are some bench warm players that really you should be putting on the bench but holding on to just to see if their value plays out?
I think the bot lane for C9 is definitely something that they should be dropped to bench warmers because after their performance in week 1, I wouldn't blame anyone for not wanting to start them week 2. However, I can foresee them getting their synergy back together maybe later in the season, and even if it's halfway in the season, they might still be able to pull out some good points. So
Right.
if you have a viable bot lane, I would drop them on the bench, but don't drop them from your roster entirely. Not quite yet, at least.
Lynx?
I would definitely keep Mimer and Rallis on the bench. I mean, given how bad their performance were and how bad Meteor Makers look as a whole, these two guys were still top performers from last split. Give them 1 or 2 more weeks. If they don't pan out, then maybe look for alternatives. But it's hard to give up on them so fast, especially because owners probably spent a high or mid-round draft pick on them.
Okay. And for me, it definitely has to be Xiao Wai Xiao. He's such a strong fantasy player that despite him not showing up right now, I would be afraid to drop him just because if someone else then picks him up and he has like a runaway week, I'm going to feel so stupid. So
Well, just to add on to that, a few more players that I'm looking at to move the bench for possibly a week or 2 are some of the unicorns of love players, actually. Hailsang, Vardogs, and Vizichachi, the bot lane and the top lane. I feel like have the potential to do well, but they're not the ones carrying the team at the moment. At the moment, it's mostly all about the jungler and the mid laner. But I still have hope, and maybe if they live up to the hype, they'll be able to pull out a good number of fantasy points.
Okay, so now we're going to move to questions from Twitch chat. Anthony, take it away.
All right, so we're gonna actually take.
I think we have some Twitter questions too.
Yeah, Twitter questions first. So for future reference, tweet us at FantasyRiftCom, and we'll answer your questions live on the stream. Our first question comes from Vorpal Sword. He wants to know if Phoenix or Jez is in mid. What do you guys think?
Okay, on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Phoenix.
Wow.
No one else answered?
Jesse.
Oh, well, I was posing the question. I was counting myself out of it.
Wow.
But I think Jesse would actually take Jez's partly because of the matchup, because TSM has a history of camping the mid lane, so I'm not sure how Phoenix will do just for this week. Overall, I would probably take Phoenix over Jez's, but if you're looking at this week, I would pick up Jez's.
All right, I have to follow the hype a little bit because I actually got into esports through StarCraft 2. Team Liquid having a team is just really exciting for me. Like, the moment they announced it, I pretty much jumped bandwagon, ordered a jacket, was like, Team Liquid! So I'm looking forward to this, but also because Phoenix really has room to grow, I think, as a player, whereas Jess is someone we've seen around for a while, and I feel like he's reached close to his peak. And yes, the TSM matchup might be hard, but we've seen Cloud9 be pretty weak, and Hai has never been the strongest laner. So Phoenix really will get to bully him around and show off his strengths if they are in the laning phase. But like you said, TSM does like to pick on mid laners, so Phoenix could fall to Bjergsen as so many other mid laners have in the past.
Alright, so what about at flex between Forgiven and Febiven? Lynn, what do you think?
I think I would probably take Forgiven. Maybe this is me speaking as an SK fan, but he seems like he's a pretty solid player who has the capacity to perform very stably. But then he also dashes in for kills, which is something we haven't been seeing lately. He's one of the AD carries who, I would like to say, puts the carry back into AD carry.
Wow.
So I expect...
Is Freak joining us today?
But I expect Forgiven to do really well, especially with his support in Rated. And Rated should be able to help out and definitely to set up some good plays for Forgiven to really capitalize on.
So for me, it has to all be about the matchups. Fnatic and SK both play against Gambit Gaming this week, so that matchup is the same. Fnatic plays against Roccat, while SK Gaming plays against Unicorns of Love. And For me, I have to go a little bit in Febiven's favor, just because if you look at who SK Gaming played last week, it's, again, Rawcat and Meet Your Makers. They played against two kind of disappointing teams. And yeah, they put up good points, but Meet Your Makers were super disappointing. Fnatic took down Elements and did it in style. And Febiven put up just a ridiculous 68.39 points, which is like, I don't even know how to count that many. I don't think I've ever had a fantasy player other than Kerp score that many points. So for me, Fnatic feels a lot like the new Millennium, except unlike Millennium, they're not going to lose half their games. So it's hard for me to bet against them right now. As much as I think Forgiven is a solid player and he's on my fantasy team, I would drop him for Febiven if I could. Not necessarily saying that's the right choice, it's just... That's what my gut tells me right now. It's always trust in Fnatic.
Well, for me, just really quickly, Febiven is my number 1 ranked mid, and Phoenix is my number 2 ranked mid for week 2. So
we know your answers.
All right. So we have a bunch of top laners coming up. How would you rank these 4 players? Quas, Chris, Whirlybee, Impact. So we got 3 NA top laners and 1 high potential European top laner. Who'd want to take this first?
Okay, I'll be brave. So I have trouble with this question because in 3 of my 5 leagues, I am holding both Quas and Chris, and I have yet to decide which one I'm starting. So I'm gonna go ahead and make this decision pretty much right now to try and weigh in. Liquid looked really solid, and I think as far as consistency goes, I would want to start Quas in future weeks. But this week, Coast has really nice matchups in both Teammate and Gravity. I think those are both matches they stand a good chance of winning. Whereas Team Liquid faces a TSM that will be looking to rebound off of their loss to Teammate, and a Cloud9 that will be, again, hungry for a win. So I think they both stand a really good chance of scoring a ton of points. I think both teams stand a really good chance of going 1-1 or 2-0, but the team that stands the highest chance of going 0-2 of those two teams is Team Liquid. Does that make sense? I think they have probably a higher average points from starting Quas.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
But the volatility is going to be a little bit high there, especially because Quas was not the shining light of Team Liquid during those games. I was rooting for him. He did not do that great. But I mean, if those are your options, you're not doing poorly. Who were the other 2 people?
Whirlybee and Impact.
Oh, God. How are they all available? Impact is a god, and I just hyped him up so much when we talked about Team Impulse. But he's untested. I wouldn't gamble on that. Whirlybee seems to rely on the jungle camp. I think people will be banning Jax, and we're going to see less of a strong performance by Whirlybee.
If I had to rank these 4 players, I would probably put them in this order. I would probably go Chris, Whirlybee, Quas, and then Impact. I'm probably underrating Impact here, to be honest. However, because he's with Team Impulse, who haven't been showing the greatest performance, and because he is untested, like Gustav mentioned, I'm not sure I would feel comfortable putting him onto my starting lineup. I would put Chris first, largely because of the matchup, but also because he has proven that he's able to get solo kills and capitalize when his jungler's there to gank for them. I would put Whirlybee second, despite the fact that I think Jax will get banned against him, is that because he has an aggressive playstyle, and just because one champion's banned against him, I don't think that's likely to change soon, and I think he'll still be able to rack up a good number of fantasy points. Quas with Team Liquid, he will likely at least pick up a lot of assists in team fights. I'm not sure how well he will do during the laning phase. I'm sure he can at least hold his own. And then I guess we'll just have to wait and see to see if Impact can make the change that Team Impulse needs.
See if he can have the right impact.
I thought Freak wasn't here, wasn't supposed to be here today. Yeah, I think that's kind of what our consensus is, that Impact has this big potential. I mean, world champion, you really can't discount that, but at the same time, we don't know what to expect. Team Impulse isn't exactly this great looking team. And I think for most people out there who's looking for solid top laners, you really can't go wrong between Quas, Chris, and Whirly B. I myself have them right next to each other, so I definitely think you can go with any of them, and you'll be in a good spot. So we're gonna go a little bit more rapid fire here, taking into account time. So I'm gonna pose 2 players, and you pick one and give a 1-sentence reason. All right. So let's start off with Phoenix or Xiao Wei Xiao. Gustav.
Phoenix. Wins get you points. Team Liquid just looks really dominant, and Xiao Wei Xiao doesn't look like himself from last split.
Lynn?
I agree with Gustav entirely. So, yeah, no need to repeat that. But yeah, and Phoenix did perform well. It's not just because of the win; it's also because he was able to do well during the laning phase and in his own mid lane.
To me, it's Phoenix, and it's not close. All right. Next one would be Yellow Star or N-Rated. We haven't been talking about supports a lot, so maybe you can give 2 sentences about which pick you're going with. Let's go with Lynn this time.
Tough choice. I would go with N-Rated, partly because I'm a really big SK fan, but partly because I feel like Fnatic does have the hype and the momentum going for them, but I feel like SK is a little more established and they're a bit more stable. N-Rated and Yellow Star have both been around forever, but N-Rated he's very good at shot calling and really mechanically skilled.
I'm gonna have to go with Yellow Star. I don't need 2 sentences. Dat Steelback, though. That's...
Point taken. I would definitely go with Yellow Star. Just kill potential is much higher on Fnatic at this point than SK. All right, going back to mid lane.
I've got one more sentence. Dat Febivin, though.
Yeah, that's a good complimentary sentence. All right, going back to mid lane. Gustav, Juzzis or Slushy? This is a bit closer this time.
You keep asking me all the questions I'm thinking about in my own fantasy league.
We're helping you out.
Okay, Slushy. No, Jess's. I'm sticking with Jess's because he's a little bit more tested, and I think he has slightly easier matchups next week. Teammate faces off against Impulse, and I'm still a little bit worried about how. I don't even know. Jess's. That's my sentence. Jess's.
Lynn?
I would take Jez's just because he played more carry-oriented mid laners. Slushy played Lulu and Orianna, which are good for team fights, but it's they might not necessarily be the ones picking up the kills.
Oh, okay, fair enough. I will go with Slushy because I believe Team 8 should show up. Between these 3, pick 2 to start. Xiao Wei Xiao, Impact, Xpepi. Lynn. So it's Xiao Wei Xiao, Impact, Xpepi.
I would take Xiao Wei Xiao and Xpepi. Just because I still see Xiao Wei Xiao getting more points than Impact, simply because teams tend to focus more resources on the mid lane, and Impact does have his history speaking for him, and the fact that he did win Season 3 World Champions. But coming into a new team, I'm not sure if he can necessarily translate that into kills and therefore fantasy points.
All right, Gustav.
I'm gonna go against the grain a little bit here. I know you should never start in your flex a non mid laner or a non AD carry, but actually, if you look at average points per game, the top score in mid was 34 points per game, and the top for a top laner was only a little bit below that at 33. If you look at the top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 people, actually half of them are top laners and half of them are mid laners. Just comparing top laners and mid laners, top seems to have like with the new meta with Lissandra and stuff. Oh, this is way more than one sentence. Top laners are getting way more points, and I think Impact will acclimate to that very well. So I'm going to go with Impact and Xpepi, actually, because the Giants look strong right now.
Rolling the dice there with Impact.
I know, right?
Definitely. You guys start Xpepi. I really like him this week. I would go with Xiao, just a little bit more proven. I don't know. I want to actually say proven because the other guy was a world champion.
Right.
But I've seen him a lot more. And I tend to go with week 1 was an aberration, and he'll bounce back. All right, last question because of the sake of time. Would you guys pick Xiao or Keane? We're getting a lot of Xiao questions.
Right.
Gustav, you want to start us off?
Sure. Keane. Now let me figure out why. Because Keane scored a bunch of points last week. I don't know.
Good reason. Lynn.
Keane, I would say Keane too, just because. Not just because of the points, but I guess I've been watching him in solo queue a lot, and he's really good at kill securing, or kill stealing, depending on how you want to look at it. So I really see him continuing to rack up those fantasy points.
Okay, yeah. I guess to add something other than he scores a bunch of points, I think Xiao will be the better pick that will mature over time as Team Impulse becomes a team, but right now they're not a team. Cool. So if you have any other questions for us for next week, we'll be going again on Monday at 7 p.m. Pacific time. So go ahead and tweet those questions at FantasyRiftCom or at any of us. All of our contact information is available on our articles at FantasyRift.com. Thank you for watching, and if you have any questions, again, pose them to us on Twitter.
I actually have one thing to add. For those of you looking for more fantasy information, go ahead and check out Face Check Podcasts. Fantasy Rift will be doing a small segment on their podcast weekly, so check them out.
All right, thanks for watching.